Good morning, 8th graders. Today we're continuing on with lesson 2.1, that is solving equations with rational coefficients. So we're on page 113. I'm going to briefly review what we talked about in our last lesson, which was using the inverse property of multiplication. Now, coefficients, which is in our chapter title, coefficients are, remember, the number that's smack dab right next to the variable, the letter. So when you have a number and a letter and they're touching each other, that tells you the number is the coefficient, the letter is the variable. So now we were talking about in one-step problems how we do the opposite, we do the inverse. Your book will call that multiplicative inverse of a fraction. So just as another recap and a reminder, when you are solving equations where your coefficient is a fraction, we're essentially doing keep, change, flip. So you divide by the fraction, and when we divide by fractions, we keep the first, change the second, and flip the second fraction. So once again, you can save a step in there and just multiply by the flip or the reciprocal, the upside down. So let's look at decimal coefficients today. And I believe this is something you have done in the past, and so hopefully should be a little bit of a review. If it's not, please raise your hand and ask for some help, and we'll make sure that you are caught up so you can complete this lesson. So in the equation, 3.15 equals 0.45n. The coefficient of n is a decimal. What that means is the coefficient of n, the variable's n, this is a decimal. In Corda speak, I would say, okay, instead of a fraction smack dab next to a variable, now we just have a decimal. To solve an equation with a decimal coefficient, we are going to divide each side of the equation by the coefficient. So in our example here, is actually our example 3, solve 3.15 equals 0.45n. So when we write it out, I can see that this n is right next to the 45 hundredths, and there's nothing in between. So just like we did in our last lesson, when it's smack dab next to each other like that, it's secretly being multiplied. So I'm going to stick a little multiplication sign there. Now in order to get that n by itself, we need to do the opposite. So ask myself, what is the opposite of multiplying by 0.45? That would be dividing. So I'm going to divide, and whatever I do to one side, remember, I have to do to the other. So that cancels out and leaves me with just an n on this side. So if I solve 3.15 divided by 0.45, I get 7. So what that means is n equals 7. And I could totally check my answer and put that 7 right back in. 45.45 times 7 should give me 315, and it does. Checked my answer. It's great. And we're moving on. I'm going to do one more example with you, and then I'm going to give you some examples to work through on your own. So let's do G together and H and I on your own. So for example, G, I'm going to write it just a little bit bigger so you can see. We have 4.9 equals 0.7t. I see that these are actually secretly being multiplied. So I'm going to do the opposite and divide by 0.7. That cancels out. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. 4.9 divided by 0.7. Oh, that equals 7. So 7 equals t. Over here, t equals 7. And I can double check my answer, because if I put 7 in for t, 7 times 7 should give me 4.9, and it does. So go ahead and do H and I on your own. When you're done, please raise your hand, get it checked, and I will give you some practice problems. Good luck, 8th grade.